So welcome everybody to Kaleido's Tech Tuesday. Today our topic is digital transformation in large enterprises with a focus on sports and media and entertainment industry case studies. We've got a special guest today. I'm really excited to welcome here Sandy from Mindspring Capital and formerly with Ticketmaster. And then obviously Nick, our regular host for Kaleido Tech Tuesdays, is here as well. And I'm Kaleido's Chief Marketing Officer, Andrew Pearson. So Sandy, why don't I just take a moment and give you a couple of introductions, because you've got a phenomenal biography, and obviously I want to invite you to share a little bit more about yourself. But just to set the stage, Sandy's currently an entrepreneur in residence at Mindspring Capital. And was vice president of product at Ticketmaster. He's got a lot of other prior roles in some really exciting large enterprises from Warner Media, Microsoft, Intel, and Lockheed Martin. He also sits on the board of the Maker Foundation, which is supporting the adoption of DAI, a popular decentralized finance blockchain cryptocurrency. And Sandy's just been involved in a ton of different really interesting blockchain projects, both evaluating, implementing blockchain as part of a wide range of digital transformation initiatives at a lot of large enterprises, but also has kind of a perspective from that startup phase, within kind of a large enterprise itself. So I think he's just got a lot of really interesting case studies. I think at the end of the day, with our focus on enterprise blockchain, really diving into, real live kind of examples of how, the exploration process, the proof of concepts, the pilots work, and how to move to production within the context of all the dynamics that, you often encounter within large enterprises. Sandy's just got such an awesome perspective. So Sandy, I haven't, said everything about you. I've left a few things off. I'd love to hear a little bit more if you wanted to introduce yourself a bit, and what have I missed?
No, actually did a great job. I may start hiring you as a publicist if you're interested. But at a high level, sort of my big background, my main thing's always been, so I've kind of had the engineering side and I've had the business side. So undergrad and grad in electrical engineering from Cornell. I also got my MBA from Wharton. And so I've kind of spread that throughout my career. So as Andrew mentioned, I've worked at Microsoft, I've worked at Intel, I've worked at Warner Media. I'm currently out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So worked quite a bit in the startup scene. So I was the COO of a company called Pixo, not Pixar. A lot of people get that confused, but Pixo, which was a social networking company for teens that was acquired back in 2008. I was also the CTO of a company called In Stadium, which was basically an ad network for large sports venues, college and professional sports venues, which was recently acquired by Gimbal. So I've worked across a lot of different industries. I also had my own tech startup around ed tech and everything like that. So I've seen a lot of industries, done a lot of things. And it was about, I think it's now 7 years ago that I heard sort of the siren song of the blockchain, specifically as it relates to Bitcoin, and as part of a whole sort of recruiting thing. Technically, it was a startup that was eventually run by the Winklevoss twins. So I have my tie in there, but that didn't work out. I didn't work with the Winklevoss twins, but it did get me interested in blockchain. A few years later, I think it was in 2015, I started a company that would eventually be called Upgraded. Upgraded was basically event tickets on a blockchain. So it was originally using colored coins, switched over to Ethereum. 3 years later, Ticketmaster acquired us. That's how I ended up at Ticketmaster. And Live Nation as the parent company for Ticketmaster, basically putting tickets on the blockchain for the world's largest ticketing company. And that was a lot of my last 2 years. So I went from scrappy startup and just, you could fit the company in a large room to thousands of people basically in the world's largest, music promoter, as well as ticketer in general, not only for music, but for sports and Broadway and everything like that. So, and, obviously 2020, everybody has their 2020 stories. For the live event space, it might be the harshest of all of them. So they've cut back on their workforce a lot this year. So I've shifted into venture capital this year with a company a group called Mindspring Capital. As Andrew mentioned, I'm an entrepreneur in residence there. So I get to look at interesting deals coming in and everything like that, and present some of my own deals and kind of stay involved. And in the meantime, also, as Andrew mentioned, and kind of keeping my 1 foot in the blockchain, sort of, straight out of Michael Corleone. Just when I'm out, they pull me back in. I joined the board of the Maker Foundation. So for those of you familiar with decentralized finance, or DeFi as they like to call it, I'm on the board of directors there, helping with DAI, which is just crossed a billion in assets right now that have been converted into this new technology, or into this new sort of currency. And that's been great, just because it's sort of the future of cryptocurrency in my mind, a very exciting space. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Oh, and I have to put as Andrew knows, I have to put the shameless plug in. I also did write a chapter in a book, basically 21st Century Innovation in Sports is the proper title for it. You can look it up. But basically, I wrote the blockchain chapter on what sports is going to look like with blockchain over the next 10 and 25 years. It was a fun chapter to write, basically, because they kept pushing like, no, think crazier, think crazy. I'm like, okay. And I kind of threw some ideas out there. But a lot of it around how smart contracts can really revolutionize how sports goes over, the foreseeable future, with everything that, kind of we did in ticketing. But in fact, I intentionally don't mention ticketing because there's so many other opportunities around everything from contracts to betting to other things like that I think could really take over.
That's great. So Sandy, not only are you essentially a veteran in the blockchain space with 7+ years history, you've crossed over and seen both the cryptocurrency and the enterprise blockchain and sort of everything in the middle. So I think that gives you a really unique and interesting vantage point. But you've seen the evolution, not just of the technology, but even kind of the adoption, the exploration within a number of different organizations and industries. So I think we've got a lot of directions we can go in, and I'd love to just milk the time that we have to kind of hear as much from your experience. Just before we dive in with kind of the first couple questions, Nick, I know Nick's had a lot of great engagement with you, Sandy, over the year plus. Nick, if you just want to give a quick introduction and anything that you're excited to get into today.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Sandy. So, hey, everyone. Nick Gasky, I do customer support and client enablement here at Kaleido. So, had many dialogues with Sandy over the last few years as they were sort of kicking off a next evolution of his software stack with Ticketmaster. So this is a particularly interesting topic for me, considering sort of my background and just the things I did before I stumbled my way into technology. So in previous lives, I actually worked for Major League Baseball and Major League Soccer and U.S. Soccer, and then actually ran a collegiate summer league program myself. So got to be very familiar with sort of some of the problems with ticketing and sort of this paper-based methodology and just how menial it can be, but then all the problems that arise, right, in terms of forgery, in terms of refunds, et cetera. So for me, what I'd like to start at sort of step one, Sandy, and just take us through the journey at Upgraded, sort of where you realize like, hey, these are the current sources of friction, with the way that ticketing is done at an enterprise scale with sports, with live entertainment. And then when you had that, in the shower light bulb moment of, hey, this is how blockchain could actually, be a very elegant technology and solve a lot of these problems. So maybe just take us through that thought exercise you had, and then we'll go down the nerdy route of sort of how you solve the problem with blockchain as well.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. So the origin story, as they like to call it a lot in the startup space, basically happened in 2015. I was working for InStadium. I think I mentioned that company earlier. It was the ad platform. And by the way, the ads went on the big screen. So when you go to a game and you go to, between batting practice and first pitch or warm-ups and tip-offs, it used to be when the company started in 2003, as a fan, you sat there and all you could do was kind of stare up at the big screen. And of course, from 2003 to 2015, people started getting, those phones in their hands. And suddenly it's like you had competition to the big screen. I was brought in to be the CTO to kind of come up with a mobile strategy that could kind of coincide with what was going on the big screen. It's like, if you can't beat them, join them. And I always like to joke that I'm a San Francisco tech VC kind of guy, and they were a Chicago marketing private equity company. So we kind of missed the boat. But I always say, out of the ashes, right? So we were starting to talk about our product. We went to pitch a customer, and the guy looked at our product and he's like, and this is a little bit to Nick, to some of your experience, but he's like, yeah, that's great. What about ticketing? And we hadn't done anything with ticketing. Like, that's the domain of Ticketmaster and tickets.com and stuff like that. So we're like, well, we haven't gotten to ticketing yet, but what do you think about this? He's like, yeah, that's fine. When are you getting to ticketing? And there's a lot of people on this call know that deal with customers on an everyday basis. When a customer asks twice, you forget what you were talking about and focus on what the customer's talking about. So we're like, well, we have an opinion on ticketing, but what do you think's wrong with ticketing? And he's like, and again, I think Nick kind of touched on it, but it's like, the problem is I give up a ticket and I don't know what happens to the ticket. I don't know if it gets resold. I don't know if it gets given to another person. I don't know if it gets copied, 10 copies of a PDF, and some wise guy goes and sells it on Craigslist, sells it 10 times. The first person gets in, the next 9 people are out of luck, having paid a bunch of money to a rogue person or anything like that. There's no tracking. There was just a lot of problems with the idea of paper, the idea of PDFs, and this non-controllable digital asset. And I remember in, sort of like that shower moment, thinking afterwards, kind of on the way home, driving home and thinking, God, digital assets are what they are. There's no way that one person can hold a digital asset, give it to the other person, and then that originator no longer has the asset. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Yes, there is. That's exactly how Bitcoin works. That's how the double spend problem works. That's how the idea of debits and credits and everything like that. And I'm like, what if we applied those lessons of sort of like Bitcoin to tickets? And that's where the very first evolution happened. And so I looked out and I'm like, okay, well, it's not actually Bitcoin, but what if we use colored coins, just tokens, and the token represented the ticket, moved around, presented that to a couple of people, started writing some really crude code. I still do write code. That's kind of one of my things. And so I wrote some code just to be able to move around colored coins from one account to another to represent a ticket and everything like that. Showed it to a bunch of people. They're like, well, the industry needs disrupting, but is this a feature? Is this a product? How does this work with existing systems? You have to uproot everything. I even went back to that original customer and he said prophetic words. He basically said, okay, that idea is good, but you don't want to get into mapping 47,000 people in a stadium and like where the seats are and everything like that. Build something on top of the existing systems. And I'm like, okay, turned out to be really, really prophetic. But the other thing that was wrong is like, that's still not quite right. Well, this is February of 2016. And that's when Ethereum hit the Homestead release. And I had a lot of friends who basically said, yeah, Ethereum, I tried it. It's buggy. It doesn't work. Like, definitely wait until another rev. And I kind of stayed away. But finally, in February, the Homestead release came out. And I'm like, I'm going to give it a try. And I always like to tell people this in 2016. I'll never forget. I said, I'm just going to give this 72 hours, download the Mist browser, download all the tools. I'm just going to mess around with it. I'm going to see what I think. And at the end of that weekend, I learned 2 very important things. Number one, Ethereum was the most interesting thing to happen to computer science in 10 years at that point. And number 2, I was throwing out all the code I had written in the previous 4 months, and I was starting from scratch on Ethereum. And Ethereum it changed. I mean, I was kind of joking, but it's actually serious. It changed my life, right? The way I've always explained it to people who aren't in tech, and I think that probably doesn't necessarily map to people on this call, and yet at the same time, when you explain to people not in tech, this might be a good way. But I always say that the difference between Ethereum and Bitcoin feels a little bit like the difference between a credit card and cash. Mm-hmm. Cash is great. I would love if you each sent me a $20 bill right now, but it's just cash. But a credit card has the ability to not only be money, but flexible amounts of money, and not only flexible amounts of money, but it can be identification. It can be a loyalty program. I have an Amazon Prime credit card so that Amazon can learn even more about me. It can be a deposit where money is taken, but then kind of given back. It's a very flexible instrument. And the idea of being able to apply that to a ticket just completely changed the game. Hey, wait a minute, we can restrict who's allowed to resell a ticket, or we can add stored value to it and all that other stuff. And suddenly the pitch changed, everything else changed. And that's where the company really started taking off.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Sandy. I think that's a great, I guess, 101 articulation of some of the core differences between kind of the UTXO model and just the more flexibility that Ethereum provides you. I've also used the, I have coins in my pocket versus sort of a credit card analogy. I think that's a good one that makes perfect sense. So let me ask one of the ugly questions then. What are sort of some of the problems that you ran into then sort of with the initial implementations at Upgraded, and then maybe segue into sort of how you share what you can share here, but sort of how you applied some of those learnings and realizations towards the second crank of the wheel at Ticketmaster after the acquisition.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was, when I think back to 2016, I think back with a lot of nostalgia, the same way that if anybody can remember a time when they had a really hard time and now you look back fondly, but at the time it was kind of excruciating. So 2016 for me was this idea where we started with Ethereum Classic, or what is now Ethereum Classic. I guess they just called it Ethereum then, kind of like Classic. But basically coming in and writing code in Solidity. And for me, I've grown to truly love Solidity. At the time, syntactically, it was close enough to JavaScript, Java, languages like that wasn't a huge deal. But part of the challenge was no one had written code for it at the time. So there wasn't a very strong community built up for it. So I always like to joke that there was a, kind of a Stack Overflow sort of site for a lot of questions. And I would both ask the questions and then answer the questions because no one answered the questions. And I was like, it's a lot different than writing for Swift because, for like an iPhone or iOS, because, every problem that could happen in Swift, someone's probably encountered and posted it on one of the boards. And with Solidity, it was kind of brand new. It was a little bit of a paradigm shift to say, okay, you're not necessarily writing to a pure server to say you're writing to a network of computers. And especially even though when I was running with OneNote, it was easier. But some of those paradigm shifts that in 2016 to now, I think now it's a little bit easier. But even being able to host a system that could run it and run it reliably, again, I'll go back to 2016, was a little bit of a challenge. The developer scaffolding, this was long before I could find something like a Truffle or some of these other tools that are out there that are interesting ways to be able to write and debug code and everything like that. So there was a lot of I'll call it, and if I can pat myself on the back for being a pioneer, but a lot of pioneer pain in being able to say, okay, how do I even kind of run this sort of thing? What are the best practices? There were no practices to really define what a best practice could be or anything like that. And ultimately, and as I kind of walked through the evolution, we had started on Ethereum Classic, and we had moved over to a hosted solution. And for the purposes of this call, I won't name them because we joined them, and that's an endorsement. We also left them, and that's less of an endorsement. So I'll just kind of say that we did move to another brand of Ethereum just because it's it's easier to have someone else host the system so that we don't necessarily have to host the system or kind of build out something that has a couple of easier developer hooks or anything like that. And we were on that system for about a year and a half to 2 years. So at that time, we were kind of the big challenge, and I think everybody probably knows about this challenge in a lot of ways because it's always been sort of the scarlet letter against blockchain is how is this thing going to scale, right? And if you think about ticketing for a second and you think about a sports event, so Major League Baseball will put as many, or National Football League will put as many as 45 or 50,000 people in the stadium. The NBA and the NHL will put about 19 or 20,000 people in the stadium. That's a lot of tickets, and everybody shows up, 10 minutes before the game to, 5 minutes after the game time. So that's a lot of throughput, and that's a lot of latency because for anybody who's been to a sporting event, you just want that ticket fast. And I always used to joke that my biggest sort of dream and nightmare was, for those of you who are sports fans on the call, I always dreamed about Lambeau Field in December. And if you know anything about, good Wisconsin football fans, they do a little drinking before the game and everything like that. So how do you deal with a slightly tipsy guy with a piece of cheese on his head looking for his ticket and not being able to pull it up because our blockchain wasn't operating fast enough? So I lived with that fear for years of wouldn't it be great to do Lambeau Field in Green Bay, Wisconsin? Then I'm like, do I really want that? And a lot of this was around how many transactions can you do? And at one point we were doing, I always say that we had to flip the script because we were doing seconds per transaction, right? And that's just not tenable in the long term. For a startup in the short term, for smaller events, and some of the first events we did were hundreds, maybe 1,000 tickets. And we found ways to kind of try to smooth the curve a little bit. But ultimately, we're like, if this is ever going to be a viable long-term solution, we've got to kind of flip the script. And the good news is that the one thing I always said to investors, the one thing I always said to customers is that, if you're familiar with the concept of disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. The idea is that technology often operates on an S-curve, which means it really sucks at the beginning. And at some point, it kind of sort of takes off and it passes sort of the sustaining innovation. Digital cameras in the 1990s, for anybody who's old enough, I know I'm dating myself there, but I had a digital camera and it was a 640 by 480 resolution, right? And I think the memory card had about 20 megs. And now each picture I take with my iPhone's like 5, 10 megs, whatever, right? Like and suddenly the digital technologies leapfrog. Blockchain, I was confident it was going to do the same thing. So basically throughout, by the time I'd gotten Ticketmaster, they loved the technology and they believed in what I was saying about that sort of S-curve that was going to happen with the blockchain that they brought me in. And by then we'd moved over to a parity blockchain. So the sort of proof of work to proof of stake jump was really important to us. And then, as Nick is well aware, about a year or so ago, we had started connecting with Kaleido because it was an opportunity for us to move over to Quorum, which we really liked because we thought it was the first solution that was really intended with the enterprise blockchain in mind. And before it was called the enterprise blockchain, we just called it sort of an internal or a private blockchain and everything like that, because we love so many things that the smart contracts could do. And of course, when you start a blockchain company in 2016, and you go through what happened in 2017, everybody was asking when my ICO was, everybody was asking if they could buy tokens from Upgraded, and everybody was asking all these other things. I'm like, we're not a cryptocurrency. We're trying to build value for our customer. And it was a little bit of a mismatch, which ultimately has kind of evolved with the idea that it's like, oh, you know what? The blockchain can be used for things other than, a token for, some sort of unique cryptocurrency that probably will be worth nothing in 3 years.
Yeah, that's I'll make a comment and then pass it to Andrew to maybe tee up the next question. But that's been a really, really sort of interesting sort of I guess theme that's sort of permeated the last 5 years. How do you remove this conflation of sort of enterprise blockchain versus these public networks and ICOs and cryptocurrencies, and then add with it the fact that Ethereum is actually, mainnet Ethereum is a public blockchain, but the protocol with a few small tweaks and a different algorithm can be used in a private permissioned authenticated setting. So it's even to this day, I think there's still slightly less of the climbing the mountain, but still a bit of an uphill battle of really trying to articulate the promise and the value of the technology versus sort of just this notion of cryptocurrencies and ICOs. So I know that's definitely probably something that you had to really harden your sales pitch on, Sandy, especially at Ticketmaster, and as you're interfacing with some of these huge Fortune customers and Major League Baseball franchises, NFL franchises, et cetera. So there's definitely empathy from our side with whatever conversations you've had as well, sort of going down those lines. So Andrew, do you want to maybe tee up sort of a follow on here for Sandy?
Yeah, absolutely. Sandy, you've got just such a breadth of experience socializing and kind of seeking buy-in for blockchain projects. And I'd just be curious to hear a little bit more. I mean, how have you gone about actually getting approval, especially from kind of senior leadership for novel technologies like blockchain? So we could dig into, companies like Ticketmaster or elsewhere, and particularly even talking about kind of that dimension where, in a lot of cases, large enterprises, many of them are years, decades, or more old. So for them adopting technology, which is only a few years old, kind of in the business space, sometimes there's some hurdles there. So just I'd love to hear some stories about that.
Absolutely. I'll start with a story and then I'll shift back to sort of some specifics about Ticketmaster. But in the idea of kind of selling to executives, I always love telling the story. So when we were acquired at the end of September of 2018. So just a little bit over 2 years ago. And in a weird sort of coincidence, that following Monday, which was October 1st, I think, of 2018, Live Nation, which is the parent company, had their global conference, which meant that all the execs from Live Nation, from Ticketmaster, descended upon Las Vegas for 3 days of meetings and, general sort of merriment, because it's Las Vegas. And so we were invited. So my first day of work at Ticketmaster was down in Las Vegas, and I was meeting people, and my head of product, who was part of the acquisition, actually was an ex-Ticketmaster employee. So he kind of knew everybody. I felt like I was a plus one at a wedding where it's like, hey, you see each other. Oh, this is my, my friend Sandy, or my, founder Sandy, or whatever, anything like that. And I remember the first guy we met, who I'd go on to be very good friends with later on, and was one of the more talented sort of senior engineers, senior VPs of engineering at Ticketmaster. And we had a conversation, and it's like, oh, we're the blockchain company. Like, okay. And he started asking, like, how does blockchain work? And we started getting into explaining consensus algorithms and how things come in nodes. And somewhere about 15 minutes into this, really smart guy too, right? So he's asking all the right questions. We're getting deep technically. I suddenly realized everything I'm saying right now has absolutely nothing to do with convincing this guy that he should be on the blockchain. It's basically an intellectual conversation, teaching something, which is fine. And, over drinks, it can be a nice thing to do, but that's not what you want to focus on. It's just very easy to devolve. And I always found that, like, blockchain conversations went into certain buckets. People would ask about consensus algorithms, and I heard about 51% attacks, and does that mean that things can get hacked, or stuff like that? They would devolve into sort of the ICO conversations, and people would ask me which cryptocurrency I should invest in, or whatever that is. Or eventually, like, I would try to steer it more towards, like, hey, you know what? There's a lot of value. There's things you can't do with a traditional technology as easily as you can in this case. And sometimes you almost have to be slightly reductive in the power of the technology to be able to basically, I don't want to say dumb it down, because that's not really fair to someone who doesn't understand it, as much as to say you need to give people an on-ramp to it a little bit, because, and I say this in the chapter in the book, but, blockchain is only 12 years old, right? Since the Satoshi white paper. It's such a young technology. Even like AI and machine learning is a lot older than that, and all these other technologies that are older than that. Can you remember where databases were at 12, right? We're not even a teenager yet when it comes to a blockchain. So you got to kind of ease off on that fear, uncertainty, and doubt that people have, and focus on, like, hey, here's the unique things you can do with it. Now, shifting over to Ticketmaster and kind of my specific realm, which I imagine a lot of people who may end up watching this, who may be in similar situations, but Ticketmaster is a 40-plus-year-old company. It does amazing things. Like, a lot of people like to knock Ticketmaster. It's an amazing company because it's one of the engineers had the greatest line. He said, it's the only company that self-imposes a denial of service onto itself, right? Because what we do is we say, at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, tickets to Taylor Swift at Madison Square Garden or wherever go on sale, or across her 10-city tour. And people love, Girl Squad, right? They all descend upon the website, shaking their credit cards and ready to give it. And we need to be able to handle that. And very few companies, like, it's almost like we have Amazon Primes, like, or Prime Days, like every other Saturday for big artists when they go on tour and everything like that. And the systems that build them are very old, right? And they're tried and true. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the ways that it's broke, they've kind of evolved the systems. But what you're talking about is a system that's built to deal with these on sales with rapid sort of major throughput, really tight latency. And at the same time, you have a season ticketing system called Arctics, which is it's best in class around doing these season ticket things. That's great. It's the crown jewels of this fantastic company. The problem is that you have a technology that isn't even half as old as these systems are, and you're trying to wedge it in. It's a little bit like that conversation between a digital native and a boomer, where, like, my daughter's teaching their grandmother how to use, like, a new technology, and it's just like, God, it's not quite fitting here, and she's not quite getting what they're saying and stuff like that. So when you walk in, you have to recognize what are the limitations of the existing system that blockchain can solve. For us, this idea of creating a multi-dimensional ticket, where if you think about the evolution of a ticket, going back 10, 15 years, especially pre-digital tickets, what was it? It was a barcode printed on a piece of paper that would eventually get scanned and go back to a back system and be like, yeah, it's done. It was very monolithic. Barcode in, out, and you're in the venue, or you're out, and sorry, we're not going to let you in. But now it's like, hey, wait a minute. There's things of the multidimensionality of a smart contract. And I always used to talk about entitlements and permissions. And entitlements are like, not only do you get access in, but you get a free bobblehead, or you get a free, bucket of popcorn or whatever it is that, like beer, soda. In fact, in one of the cases, I always like to say that one of our customers was a race car track, and I'm from the Northeast. We don't really watch race car driving, so the idea is that you got 4 free beers with your ticket. And I always joke that that was an appropriate one, because that's how many beers it would take for me to watch cars go around in circles for a couple hours. But so little shot. I know there's some North Carolina people here. I can't resist about auto racing. But the point is that we could create a multi-dimensional ticket, and that smart contract could legislate how many beers and whether the beers were taken. And suddenly it's not just a barcode for a seat, but it's a lot more than that. And then the permissioning and the identity associated with that smart contract is really unique, because suddenly that thing is alive. And again, it goes back to the credit card versus the cash or the change in the pocket, as Nick described it. It's like, hey, you know what? Sandy owns the ticket. He can resell it. But if Sandy gives it to Andrew, the original ticket holder is no longer allowed to resell the ticket, because we allow this as a one and done transfer. We're only allowing one transfer, because the idea was, or even better, it's like it's fan club tickets. I get the ticket, but I can only give it to another fan club member. I can't go on a resale market or on Craigslist and try to flip it for $1,000, $100 ticket, and then I'll go buy another cheaper ticket, move further back, and make $800 in profit or something like that. So when you start putting around these very real world experiences, you focus less on the technology. In fact, I had a slide when I presented both internally and externally, where it's basically like, which consensus algorithm should I use? Is it proof of work or proof of stake, this and that? And I put a big stamp that says, who cares? It's like, I do care about that personally, but you shouldn't. What you need to care about is what the business end value is to the customer, what you can do more flexibly. And I always used to talk about it specific to tickets, is that imagine a world, and this would sell a lot of people, is that imagine a world where there's 2 tickets right next to each other, 2 seats right next to each other, but their tickets are completely different, right? You can create this asymmetry in these entities that are tickets, which wasn't necessarily found before. You can create an autonomous operation because the functionality can exist contained within the ticket, as opposed to a server that kind of does that. And then we always used to joke about space dust, which was the idea that when the event was over and the ticket would go away, it's gone, as opposed to, as we all know, anybody who's done enterprise development, you write a bunch of code for a unique situation, and then it sits there as cruft. You don't want to remove it because something might break, and yet at the same time, on the flip side of it, it's more surface area for bugs or for security holes or all these other sorts of things. And then suddenly we're writing smart contracts. The smart contract happens. The ticket's ephemeral, which means the day after a Beyonce concert, the Beyonce ticket doesn't really hold any value. So we can just kind of let it go, and then the code sits on the side. And when you start presenting these ideas, the technical ideas that aren't about how blockchain works as much as how you'll be able to do things more efficiently, and the business idea that says, hey, you can go to a customer and promise them something you've never been able to promise before, suddenly they're like, okay, this makes me money. If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. Suddenly they're seeing the opportunity to make things more efficient, to modernize things, and to create new business opportunities. That was our sale as upgraded, and that's ultimately why Ticketmaster made the investment to bring us in.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, and that was always one of the things that was so exciting to me about your work at Ticketmaster and your approach to this of, not sort of looking at it very myopically and saying like, hey, let's just have a dummy smart contract or a real simple non-fungible token and allow that to just represent this ephemeral ticket, as you mentioned, but looking at the forest rather than just the tree and say, how can we sort of, provide new business value and, build out new streams of revenue or frankly, just more customer engagement, right? With loyalty points or with these different, bifurcations of this ticket allows you to do this and transfer 1 or 2 times. And this ticket is sort of just a static object that you can't transfer to anyone. And really exciting, like all of the possibilities that are available there. Hard to, sort of stop your brain from spinning when you're exploring those. So one thing I'd love to get your perspective on, obviously ticketing is going to be a differentiator here, but at Kaleido, we're lucky enough to deal with a huge breadth of different, industry clients across healthcare, government, obviously media and entertainment, supply chain, et cetera. So I wonder if you can just sort of just brainstorm and help identify some of the core differences between maybe sports and entertainment and some of these other industries as it applies to blockchain. So I'll chuck out a few obvious ones. When we deal with healthcare, or, we deal with, personally identifiable information, privacy becomes incredibly important sort of in a insurance or a healthcare industry use case. But, identity, end user identity is not that important in those use cases. It's more about organizational identity, where private keys, it's okay to hold those private keys on the server side or on the node. Whereas with ticketing and sports and entertainment, now we start seeing the value of, hey, I want to prove that I'm the only one that owns this non-fungible token and I'm the only one that can spend it. So as a result, I need a nice mobile application and I need to be the only custodian of that private key. So just an easy one, like out of the box right there, just in terms of key management, identity, privacy. But what are some other thoughts that you have as you compare maybe, healthcare supply chain to sports and media and entertainment?
Yeah, no, it's an awesome question. And I think, if you think about it, like, our customer was in a lot of cases, the sports leagues, the sports teams, and ultimately there's a fan on the end of that ticket, right? And so the idea of being able to manage that experience in a way so that the fan doesn't necessarily have to manage their own keys. I think there's other blockchain companies that we talk to, ticketing companies, where they're like, okay, so the fan has a key and they open up their Mist browser, and it's like, yeah, we have to kind of shield them from all the complexities of technology because, and the beauty of sports, one of the things, and actually this isn't wildly different than healthcare, but it certainly is in a lot of other industries, is the fact that sports has such a broad appeal that you have very wealthy, very well-to-do, very tech-savvy people on one end, and you have people that are not made of as many means and cannot afford the latest iPhone and everything like that. And you have to make sure you're supporting every different type, right down to we had weird Android issues and stuff like that, just even on the non-blockchain sort of ticketing side or everything. But in this case, our intermediary customers, which is the teams, aren't necessarily that sophisticated. One of the things with healthcare that you get is that there's usually a very strong investment made in IT. And there's a lot of capability that it's like, okay, can you hand this off to someone and trust that this person is going to run it across the finish line? And that's not always the straightaway case with a lot of the sports teams. Some of the sports leagues have it, but what you have is a very asymmetric way that teams work. You have some teams that are really what's the word I'm looking for, like avant-garde on the edge of technology. So I always think about like the Golden State Warriors or the San Francisco 49ers out here in the Bay Area, maybe partly because they're in the Bay Area, but they've invested a lot in technology and they've done some amazing things. And then you have some franchises that are run a lot tighter. And the idea is that you have to be able to support each one. So making sure that the technology can kind of scale to the capability of your customers is an interesting piece, right? So you want to almost, in the world of standard and deluxe versions or whatever, you want to make sure as a baseline. We used to have something called Core Ticket, which was a standard, just the fax ma'am ticket that just had an owner, had some very rudimentary sort of functionality, and that's it, because we didn't want to overcomplicate what we were dealing with the specific customers that were there, as well as their customers. And then we had ones that had all the bells and whistles you could possibly imagine to basically say, let's push the envelope in what we're doing down this path. So I think that's part of it is like understanding that the customers and the sophistication of both the customers as well as in a B to B to C sort of world, that second B and that C aren't necessarily sophisticated. So how do you kind of manage to what you're dealing with in that standpoint? And then even beyond that, okay, how do we make sure we can grow so the time that they're willing to adopt these sorts of things, we can shift? And that's one of the things that I loved about the blockchain is that it's like, hey, you know what? In 2019, you're using a ticket that looks like this. And well, all of a sudden you're like, hey, I want to do what they're doing. It's like, yeah, we can actually flip the smart contracts. We don't have to go back and do any legacy stuff on those old smart contracts. They exist the way they are. And now we're going to create this new version. We had one team that basically had 247 permutations of tickets, and the next highest was 20. And we can do something for those 247, but we want to still make sure that we're doing right by the 20. So this asymmetry of the types of customers involved was a little bit of a challenge. And then I'll go back to something I said earlier, that throughput and latency, the idea that you have this really tight window when people need to be able to render the information, or they're doing last minute transfers and everything like that. And it needs to happen fast because they're anxious, because they really want to go in. They hear the roar of the opening kickoff and they're still online and everything like that. And one of the things that we had done, and I think we even did some of this with you guys with Kaleido, or, you know, we'd shared some of this, which was the idea of being able to dynamically reallocate and sort of interleave instructions so that if we saw that an event was happening, so we had sort of a pipeline of instructions that went into the blockchain. And if we saw that it was 12:55 and it's a 1 o'clock game, we'd move that to the top of the list, as opposed to when you're doing an on sale and you're getting that Taylor Swift ticket, which isn't going to play out for another 6 months. It's okay if you wait a few minutes for your ticket. So that idea of assigning almost sort of a priority level, and we call this sort of a triage of those instructions to make sure that we can optimize the blockchain. That speeds something that usually isn't as common in a lot of the other industries, where there's no one in the other one saying, come on, like, you know, game's about to start, I need to get my beer still, and all that other stuff.
Sandy, I was kind of curious if you could elaborate a little bit about the kind of some of the differences that you've seen between you know, sports and sort of the media and entertainment industry, and even other industries. Like, what are some unique, you know, particularities about the different industries when it relates to enterprise blockchain adoption, or you know, anything that, you know, digital transformation efforts? How have you seen that play out?
Yeah, you know, and I've sort of had the fortune within sports to kind of be behind the camera and in front of the camera, in the sense that I used to work for Warner Media, and or what is now Warner Media at the time was Turner Broadcasting. So that's the NBA on TNT, and they also do the Final Four and March Madness and everything, and March Madness, but also Major League Baseball playoffs, things like that. And then now I've been sort of in a venue world, both within stadium and working with like the big screen, and then with Upgraded and Ticketmaster and Live Nation, working with the ticketing around there as well. And I think, you know, the difference is that, like, when you're dealing with broadcast and you're dealing with mass audiences and stuff like that, it's a combination of, there's interesting opportunities there. You're dealing at more of a mass scale, and, you know, it's broadcast at the end of the day. You're dealing with millions of viewers. For anybody who's a football fan, if you watched last night's game, it was an amazing game on ESPN between the Ravens and the Browns, and millions of people were watching it and dealing with it on Twitter and everything like that. But ultimately, if I remember correctly, the game was in Cleveland. So basically, the Cleveland Stadium, the Browns are a very different business than Turner, in the fact that it's, I believe it's owned by the Haslams, and they're running it as a smaller business. So it's one of the most influential businesses. I'd imagine the franchise value of the Cleveland Browns probably on the order of $1 billion. And a lot of sports teams are going for that amount. But it's not run, you know, it's run as a very tight ship. It's run as a very small organization. So the ability to affect change with technology, as much as I can tell you about Ticketmaster and the idea that Ticketmaster is willing to do a lot of these changes because they are Ticketmaster, and we do 400 million tickets a year and everything like that. And I'm not picking on the Browns. The Browns are a great team, obviously, but you know, they operate on a very different scale. So that matching of all the different sorts of things, and this goes back to a little bit of what I said about the difference between sports and healthcare, that it's like the businesses are run differently, and because each of these franchises are very different, the ability to adhere to each of their needs is unique. One of the things that I loved about blockchain, going back to the idea of a smart contract is really the atomic unit in which you're doing development, is that you can use the same infrastructure, but you can build a unique smart contract that's better for the Cleveland Browns than it might be for the New England Patriots or anything like that, based on specific customer needs. And again, what happens is, and this is not specific to blockchain, but certainly blockchain's probably dealt with it more than anything else, is that if you can get past the initial fear, uncertainty, and doubt of a customer who just eschews change because, like, change is bad and change leaves like vulnerability, and you have to focus on, yeah, but here's what you're going to be able to do that you were never able to do before. In sports, part of the challenge is that a lot of these teams, the technology isn't as clear in ROI as it would be in healthcare or in finance or any of these other sorts of places. When I was at Microsoft, we worked with a lot of financial institutions, a lot of insurance. A good technology change had an enormous ROI. if you are, just to name another one, the New York Yankees. The New York Yankees are an amazing I'm an Orioles fan. It kills me, but the New York Yankees are an amazing franchise, and they pack the house every night. So what technology is going to change their ROI? Being able to sell them on it is a lot harder than a lot of these other industries and everything like that. I always say that I live in the Bay Area. There's the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's. Neither of them are Ticketmaster customers, but they are about 10 miles as the crow flies across the bay, but they couldn't be more on different planets in terms of their world. The San Francisco Giants sell out pretty much every game. The Oakland A's usually have about 20 to 30,000 empty seats. So trying to adhere to both of their needs, even though they're both Major League Baseball teams and, again, very close to one another, it's more challenging than where you're in healthcare and the problems are common, or you're in finance and problems are common. So you find a good solution for Goldman Sachs, it'll make sense for JP Morgan or something like that. So that's, again, I've turned that, or I've tried to turn that weakness into a strength, where I've taken those unique things and say, hey, the ability to have these customizable smart contracts, and again, these asymmetric smart contracts, means that we can adhere to both customers while keeping the common baseline. Whereas if you try to write a server product, you end up watering it down for the sake of trying to support everybody. So in the world of trying to please all the people all the time, you've got a better chance of doing it with a blockchain smart contract than you have doing it with a traditional server deployment.
Yeah, that's I guess one takeaway for me for this chat here is just, you've articulated sort of, this is, at Upgraded, at Ticketmaster, it's not an industry problem. You're approaching these customers as, different entities, right? They have different IT acumen, like inside of their own shops, and they have different appetites for, dealing with emerging technology and different approaches to fan engagement. So there's not a one size fits all. And I think that's, really interesting as we talk about, maybe someone does have 250 permutations of a ticket, whereas someone else only has 20, right? How do we let technology and these smart contract programming paradigms sort of help solve that problem? So really fascinating. I want to get back to sort of like maybe what's going to come in sports and entertainment and some predictions, but selfishly just want to touch on Kaleido a little bit here, and sort of maybe help you sort of talk us through, what brought you to Kaleido and what problems and sort of services embedded kind of in our DNA and in our infrastructure help solve problems that you were having. So just maybe just share some reflections on sort of your usage of Kaleido and any things that we help solve, and sort of how your feedback on the platform, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny because and I mentioned a little earlier about sort of our evolution, and we had gone to an external provider. And then when we built on Parity, we had actually run the system ourselves. And I will tell you right now that in that time that we were on Parity, and Parity is a fine implementation of blockchain and everything like that, but like I would lose sleep every night because I'm like, I can't believe my developers convinced me that we could run our own blockchain. Like, what are we doing? And if the thing goes down, like, am I going to get sued? And like, am I going to have to give back all the like acquisition money and all my investors' money and stuff like that? And, I think in addition, and we were getting better performance, which was an important thing with Parity at the time. But I also believe, there's just a lot where I felt like we were very inefficient in the way that we were doing the blockchain. And the way we had kind of gone down the blockchain development path is that, we had our instance of the blockchain. We had created what I would describe as sort of a subsystem that was, or, a super system, whatever, that sat on top of it, that did some of the things around, as I described earlier, the interleaving of instructions and some of the other triage and stuff like that. And even some outer order execution when some of the, because keep in mind, when someone transfers 4 tickets, we have to do 4 different smart contract calls and everything like that. And we built this system, and at some point I was like, okay, I need to optimize on every level. And then ultimately we also had a UI. And on the implementation level, I kept saying over and over again, and my head of product probably got tired of hearing, I'm like, I just wish there was a system where it was like when I was at Microsoft back in the day, we used to talk about the idea of wind tone, right? Like the idea, like, could we create like a service that you pick it up, it's kind of like a dial tone tone's there, it's ready to work for you, and you know how it works. Like, can there be a system out there that it's just like, I just hit the blockchain and I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I just know that when I create a Solidity contract, someone's got it, and it's everything like that. And at the same time, we were sort of like think we've kind of exceeded where parity is. I think parity is built to do something else. And at the same time, we found Quorum, which I'm sure a lot of people on this call know is sort of the JP Morgan implementation. By accident, by great fortune, we found Kaleido and the fact that what you guys were doing. And it was kind of like, oh, wow, you know, I might be able to kill a couple of birds with one stone here, because I can move to a blockchain that I think is more built for the enterprise as opposed to sort of, you know, kind of permuting a publicly, you know, a blockchain that's built a little bit more for the public. And then on top of that, I can have that dial tone, you know, block tone is the way I kept jokingly call it. It's like, I want the block tone where somebody's handling it, somebody's optimizing and everything like that. And one of those sorts of like, you know, there's a line in a Foo Fighters song, looking for a dime, I found a quarter, right? You know, you go looking for something, it's like, oh my God, this is so much better. Is that I got, and this, you know, this probably sounds like a commercial for Kaleido, but like I am honestly, sincerely grateful, because I came in and I, you know, one of the engineers that, you know, Nick, you know, Stas, like came in with me and we're looking at all the other features beyond the features that like we were just looking. We're just like, hey, just spin up a Quorum one and like just trust that it works and everything like that. And all these additional features, from like, you know, the Hashi Vault and the ideas of being able to handle the private keys to some of the optimization. And there were a couple of times when like, and I don't know if you know this, Nick, but like my engineer like would be like, hey, this is the thing you had me built, only they built it better. And I'm like, okay, don't tell anybody at Ticketmaster that. They're really proud of like that we built this other thing, right? But you guys, you know, what I really have loved about Cloud is that they're all these services, and it's sort of like, hey, you know what? You thought of the things that someone who's just getting to blockchain. So I'm sitting here with 4 or 5 years experience writing blockchain code. And it took me to at least those first 3 or 4 years to realize, oh, it'd be great if we did this, and it'd be great if we did this. And then you get there and it's kind of like, oh, this is already here. And it's just like, you know, turn on this feature, turn on that feature. And going back to the idea of, again, I always say that like, one of the reasons I love MakerDAO as a cryptocurrency is my issue with Bitcoin was always like, well, what really backs a Bitcoin? It's the whole tulip thing. And I'm like, MakerDAO has like, you know, decentralized finance. It's basically collateralized. Wow, it solved the biggest problem for Bitcoin. Same thing happened for me for a lot of the enterprise blockchain, which is like, how do we trust the reliability that the thing is going to stay up? How do we deal with tools that get us better throughput, better latency, and everything like that? How do we get more security? Because that's one that I haven't talked about, but is insanely, again, one of those things that I lost sleep on. And the beauty for Kaleido is like a lot of that stuff is just built into the product. It's a very easy to use environment. Before I even gave it to my engineer, I myself was the one spinning up, you know, instances. And, you know, I think Nick and your colleague Vinod, like you guys were incredibly patient with me. I appreciate that. And by the way, and again, I'll give a shout out here to you, Nick. Like, you guys were so responsive that absolutely blew me away. And I think having someone who kind of shepherds you through it's that Sherpa as you're going up this blockchain mountain and everything like that, that was really, really valuable. Even for a guy like me who'd been working with blockchain at that point for about 3 or 4 years, to just basically say, okay, I'm moving on another one. Some of my assumptions work, some of my assumptions don't work. How do we migrate this over? And by the end, I was basically able to take the performance data we were getting off of that Quorum database with some of the testing we were doing, throw it over to the execs. And I'm like, by the way, here's where we were back when you acquired us, you know, seconds per transaction. And here's what we're getting, pushing a bunch of tickets through for just, you know, we had modeled what certain concerts and certain on sales looked like. And we were getting phenomenal numbers. And a lot of it was leveraging some of the great technology that basically Kaleido makes available to every customer. It's almost like at some point it's the, you know, you almost don't want to give out. It's like, okay, I got a secret, but I want to make it look like I did it. But in reality, it was a lot of the great work that you guys had done. And the thing I reminded a lot of people internally when I kind of copped to the fact that I was working with you guys is you guys are constantly working on more stuff. And I'm like, I would rather at that base level, going back to the idea of base level, the subsystem, and then the front end, it's like, I'd rather trust you guys to be able to optimize what's going on in that base layer. You guys are much more capable and savvy and intelligent about this stuff than I am. Let me focus on the customer. Let me focus on making sure I'm delivering value that will convince that, you know, that NFL team that it's like, hey, you know what, we need a little bit more blockchain over here to do these cool things that we want to do for our fans to make more money.
Yeah.
And that was one of the great things about, like, I feel like the way we work with you guys.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for those kind words, Sandy. The last thing you said is really kind of like our whole ethos, right? Of like, don't worry about the blockchain, right? We got you covered there. You get value, within your company based on your end users and your clients. So put your effort into writing smart contract logic, and then really put your effort into a fantastic user experience and a beautiful interface and mobile application as well. Just for folks, it was a super fun project for us to work on in conjunction with Ticketmaster, and hopefully we can revive this maybe down the road somewhere as we get butts back in the seats in these concerts and in these stadiums. But just manipulating the technology, changing the target gas limit, right? You guys had very sophisticated smart contracts that were quite large, and we wanted to be able to deploy a lot of those in quick succession and try to minimize latency, and then weaving in event streams for notification to your application tier versus doing WebSocket polling. That's what we built Kaleido to be. It's like, yeah, here's 5-10% of blockchain as a service, and then here's all the other bells and whistles and maybe off-chain functionality that you're going to need as well. So awesome, Sandy. Maybe we'll record that 5-minute snippet as a material. Okay, Andrew, let me punt it over to you to wrap up sort of our last handful of minutes here.
Yeah, fantastic. Sandy, this has been a really great presentation and fireside chat, if you will. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope that our audience has too. I think, just to summarize a few big takeaways for me, the journey is going to be different for every client, even within the same industry. And a lot of that just, requires kind of a good degree of listening, the willingness to explore, to a degree, kind of extract yourself from some of the technology questions in the early stage as you think about, what is the value that can be created, what's the innovation opportunity here. And I think that then the choice of technology sort of unfolds from there. Totally agree with you. I think, all that blockchain plumbing, that infrastructure, some of the architectural and maintenance options, these days we're fortunate in that now that we're a few years into enterprise blockchain, platforms like Kaleido, can be there to provide and sustain and evolve that infrastructure, so you can really focus on building a technology that's actually unique and appropriate for the given solution at hand. So, but really awesome to hear kind of your insights from the journey, even back when a lot of this, even at the infrastructure level, was kind of a DIY project. So thanks for that. One thing I just wanted to kind of remind folks we've got this really exciting book, which is available on Amazon. Sandy, you're a contributor to this. So the title is 21st Century Sports, How Technologies Will Change Sports in a Digital Age. We're going to give away a copy or two to folks here, and actually just the way to enter to win, all you got to do is message the panelists just so we know that you indeed are interested and would like that in your holiday gift bag this winter. Or you can also email us marketing@kaleido.io. We'd especially love any follow-up questions you can think about, any feedback, any requests for future Tech Tuesdays. This is a great opportunity for you to let us know, but most importantly, get entered to win a copy just by raising your hand that way. Sandy, if you wouldn't mind, maybe in a couple short minutes, maybe give us a little teaser about what we would find if we read this, kind of in some of the contributions that you've made.
Sure. So broadly speaking, there's about, I think, 25 to 30 chapters written on. It's basically a collection of essays around a bunch of mostly educators, but some people in the industry pontificating on how technology is going to impact sports in the future. So some of it's around artificial intelligence, machine learning, cloud computing, things like that, and Internet of Things. For me, obviously, sort of, I'm the blockchain, or as I was known at Ticketmaster, the blockchain guy, so I can't resist. But I, as well as one other person, has written a chapter around blockchain. In my case, it's a little bit the explanation of blockchain. So again, for the uninitiated, nobody on this call probably necessarily needs it. And then some of the ideas around how it's going to change the way contracts are written, how it's going to change betting, how it can change amateur sports. It's a fun book in the sense that it really is, it's not necessarily conjecture. It's sort of educated guesses or hypothesis on like how all these amazing new technologies that are coming out are going to be impactful. I think with blockchain and the fact that there are 2 blockchain chapters, it's kind of cool to think about, okay, you know what, smart contracts can really change the way an event is run, the way sports is run. And so for me, it was a lot of fun to kind of go out of my element, because I think I almost intentionally avoid ticketing, been there, done that. It's more about all these other places that fundamentally change when two people can participate in contract without an intermediary necessarily being there because of the capability of what a blockchain does. So I think it's a good book. My colleague wrote the chapter on cloud, Christina Chase, who's over at MIT. And the Sasha, who's the editor, basically got a lot of the top professors around Europe to enjoy it as well. So I think interesting stuff. And it's the PS5 of sports 21st century books. How about that?
Awesome. Well, I certainly look forward to giving it a read myself, Sandy. Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're at the hour. So for folks who've already been to a Tech Tuesday and maybe kind of heard the brief overview of Kaleido, we're just going to spend a couple quick minutes, and Nick will kind of just give us an overview for anybody who's new here. But Sandy, once again, thank you so much for your great presentation, all your partnership. We look forward to working together in the future as well.
So, Nick, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks a bunch, Sandy. I was going to ask you if you had any bold predictions for 2021, but it sounds like the answer is just read my book, and I'll talk to you about loyalty programs and betting and new digital paradigms. So we'll let you save your vocal cords on that one. So I'll spend 90 seconds max on this, folks, and just honor everyone's time. So just at a super high level, Kaleido, we are industry use case agnostic, so applicable to sports and media entertainment, but equally applicable to healthcare, trade finance, supply chain, et cetera. The platform itself, either in the user interface or the RESTful API layer that sits underneath every service and every admin call, is trivially simple for even a business person or a junior developer, and then built for the enterprise. We have a ton of things just in the DNA of the product: high availability, disaster recovery, auto scaling, but then a lot of additional features like key management, off-chain, document storage, X509, personal identity constructs, et cetera. So all of these are kind of like woven into the DNA of Kaleido. Next slide, maybe. And then I guess this is the last one. I mentioned this, and something that Sandy alluded to as well is that, it is, a bit of a pain to try to stand up the infrastructure yourself, manage rolling upgrades, manage decentralized IT across maybe multiple clouds or multiple regions. And that's hard. But at the end of the day, the actual blockchain layer, it's a pretty small portion of the overall stack, right? Those smart contracts and those nodes and those consensus algorithms, you need to have that RESTful API layer. You need to have all of these different answers around storage, around identity, around key management, around oracles, you name it. So that's one of the huge value props of Kaleido, is that, we've likened ourselves almost to a cloud services catalog, where we have all of these plug and play services that, again, have a REST API sitting underneath them and make it very easy for you not to become an expert in tokens, but to just, make a couple calls or press a couple buttons and have your own ERC20 smart contract, or tell Kaleido about, your application endpoint, and we'll deliver you updates about state changes that are happening on the blockchain. And we've covered all these topics in previous Tech Tuesdays. So if folks are interested, I'd encourage you to YouTube Kaleido Blockchain, and Andrew and folks have created beautiful curated playlists, so you can grab and choose anything you want. We're always reachable at marketing@kaleido.io, support@kaleido.io. And if you just visit kaleido.io, there's a get started button, and it'll take 30 seconds to create an account. We don't want any of your money. We just want you to use the platform, give us feedback, and then we can transition into deeper technical and commercial conversations as your use case requires. So that's it. Maybe that was 2 minutes, not 90 seconds, but pretty brief nonetheless. So I'll just say thank you one last time to Sandy. That was fantastic stuff. I always love hearing your stories and sort of your learnings and reflections. So hopefully folks got a lot of value out of this as well. Andrew, any final thoughts for you?
No, this is fantastic. Certainly, we'll see digital transformation continue to accelerate. 2020 was definitely a booster shot for many different reasons. So Sandy, we really look forward to seeing kind of your next phase and what you get up to in 2021. So keep us updated. And then to everybody who's joined, just a reminder, kick off an email to marketing@kaleido.io if you want to get entered for the drawing. I see a couple folks have already pinged us through the panelist chat. And enjoy that book if you are the winner. And for some reason, if you aren't, you can order it on Amazon. If you have any questions for us, don't hesitate to reach out. And again, this has been a Kaleido Tech Tuesday. And thank you for your time. Thanks, Sandy.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sandy. Have a happy holidays to everyone, and stay tuned for upcoming Tech Tuesday content.